Words have always held power. Long before laws were written or borders were drawn, it was words that shaped people's sense of who they were, what they stood for, and where they were going. In times of peace, words build bridges. In times of conflict, they are weapons or shields, and in moments when a nation stands on the edge uncertain of what it is or what it will become, it is words that pull it back or push it forward. The speech you're about to hear is a masterclass in the use of words not just to impress, but to inspire, not just to speak, but to lead. This is not about clever lines or empty applause. It is about language used at its highest level, to awaken, to clarify, to unify. It shows us that when the right words are spoken at the right moment, they can remind a country of its soul. This speech came at a time when cynicism was high and trust in leadership was low. The country was tired of promises and deeply divided by politics, class, and race. Many believed words no longer mattered, that speeches were just performance. And then, this message broke through the noise, calm, thoughtful, and fearless. It didn't shy away from the truth. It didn't sugarcoat. It acknowledged pain, it acknowledged division, but it also declared, we are more than our worst fears. We are still bound by common values if we choose to honor them. In this speech, words were not used to avoid problems, they were used to face them. Each sentence was carefully crafted, not just for impact, but for honesty. The speaker didn't talk at the people, he talked with them. That's the difference. Real leadership doesn't preach from above, it reaches out and draws people in. And that's exactly what happened here. People didn't just hear the speech, they felt it, and they remembered it, because it wasn't just about what was happening, it was about who we are. Think about the greatest speeches in history. They weren't always delivered during victory celebrations or parades. Most were born in crisis. They arrived when people were confused, angry, or afraid. What made them powerful wasn't the setting or even the speaker. It was the clarity, the moral courage, the ability to say, here is where we stand, and here is what we must do. That's what happened here. This speech took difficult truths, racism, inequality, disillusionment, and did something incredibly rare. It faced them without fear. It admitted that the country was not perfect. It admitted that anger and division were real, but it also reminded us that democracy is not built on perfection. It's built on our ability to reflect, to argue, to correct, and most importantly, to keep trying. That's what makes this message more than just a collection of eloquent phrases. It is a lesson in democratic responsibility, in the power of rhetoric not as performance, but as public service. This speech shows that words, when rooted in truth and values, can restore something fragile, belief. Not blind belief in a leader, but belief in one another, belief that a nation's story is still being written and that everyone has a pen. Words like the ones spoken here don't just land in the moment. They linger, they become part of how a generation thinks about its identity and its future. They are studied in classrooms, quoted in movements, whispered in protests, and remembered in silence. Because these words gave people something rare, the feeling of being seen and heard without being manipulated. And in a time when division sells and anger spreads fast, that kind of language is revolutionary. But the brilliance of this speech isn't just in its poetry, it's in its purpose. It doesn't just sound good, it means something. It is proof that the spoken word, when delivered with integrity, can move a nation not just emotionally, but morally. It is proof that a president can be a teacher, that a speech can be a turning point, that words, when wielded wisely, can become tools for healing rather than weapons for harm. So if you've ever wondered whether words still matter in an age of distraction, this speech answers you. If you've ever doubted whether rhetoric can still hold weight in a cynical world, this message shows you it can. Because the right words, spoken with truth, can do more than explain, they can elevate. They can lift a country's eyes from what divides us to what connects us, and in doing so, they remind us of who we are and who we still have the power to become. Hope is not the easy choice. It never has been. It is not something you turn to when the sun is shining and everything is in your favor. Hope is what you hold on to when the storm is raging, when the lights go out, when the road disappears beneath your feet and no one is there to cheer you on. Real hope is not passive. It is not naive. It is an act of defiance, a radical decision to believe in something better, even when everything around you tells you not to. In this speech, the idea of hope is not presented as a simple slogan or a political device. It's not shallow optimism. It is portrayed as a force, a disciplined, courageous belief that change is possible if enough people are willing to fight for it. That kind of hope isn't weak. It's muscular. It's built through pain, loss, failure, and the long, exhausting process of progress, and when spoken in this speech, it doesn't come across as a wish, it comes across as a demand. This message came at a time when millions were feeling forgotten, working hard and falling behind, watching communities divide, watching truth become twisted, watching fairness disappear in the noise. And still, the speaker chose hope. Not because the situation was perfect, but because he believed people deserved more than despair. He believed the country was still capable of growth, still worthy of faith. And he had seen firsthand what ordinary people could do when they chose to believe in one another. He reminded us that hope is not about denying reality, it's about facing it with open eyes and still choosing to build something better. It's about understanding the weight of history, the pain of injustice, the burden of inequality, and saying, we're still going to try. It's about refusing to let fear write our future. It's about declaring that our dreams are not foolish and that our struggles are not in vain. What makes this idea so powerful in the speech is how it's tied to responsibility. Hope is not offered as a gift. It's a challenge, a call to action. The speaker makes it clear. Hope only works if you do. If you get up, if you vote, if you teach, if you care for your neighbors, if you organize, hope, he says, is not something we wait for, it's something we create together, one decision at a time. In dark times, it's easy to give up. It's easy to scroll past problems, to tune out the noise, to say, it's not my job. But this speech flips that instinct on its head. It argues that dark times are exactly when hope matters most, that anyone can be hopeful when things are good. But it's the person who hopes in struggle, who still believes in justice when they've never seen it, who still gets up and tries to make things better even after they've failed, that person is leading the way. It's not just individuals the speaker calls on, it's the whole nation. He speaks of hope as a contract we renew with each other, not with blind patriotism, but with active faith, faith that the future can belong to all of us, not just the lucky few, faith that a country can correct its mistakes, faith that even when progress stalls or slips backward, it can still be reclaimed, and he doesn't shy away from the truth. Hope is hard, it gets tested. It gets mocked. It gets worn down by bad headlines, broken systems, and cruel voices. But that's what makes it so valuable. If hope were easy, it wouldn't be meaningful. What gives hope its power is that it persists not out of ignorance, but out of determination. That's why this speech still resonates, because in a world that often rewards anger, suspicion, and division, choosing hope is revolutionary. It's a refusal to settle for what is. It's a promise to fight for what could be. It's a quiet rebellion against apathy, and in the hands of a great leader, it becomes contagious. People walked away from this speech not just with goosebumps, but with purpose. They felt seen, but also called. And that's what real hope does. It doesn't just comfort, it motivates. It asks something of you. It gives you enough light to take the next step, and then trusts you to keep walking. So when you listen to this message, don't just hear hope, feel what it demands. Understand that you are part of what gives it life, and remember that in every dark chapter of history, someone, somewhere chose hope anyway, not because they were sure they would win, but because they refused to surrender. That's what this speech teaches us. Hope isn't weak, it is resistance, it is action, it is love in motion, and it is always the beginning of something better. Division is easy. It feeds on fear, anger, and the instinct to protect what we know. It whispers that someone else's gain is your loss, that someone else's story threatens your own. Division takes no courage, it only requires that you close your heart and harden your mind. And in moments of stress, change, or uncertainty, it can feel like the only option. But this speech pushes back against that lie with force and clarity. It reminds us that unity is not automatic, it is a decision, one that must be made again and again. not when it's convenient or when everyone agrees, but especially when it's uncomfortable, especially when wounds are fresh, especially when the temptation to retreat into tribes feels justified, because true unity is not the absence of difference, it's the commitment to something greater than difference. This message came at a time when the country was being pulled apart politically, racially, economically. People were exhausted. Conversations had turned into shouting matches, and in that climate, calling for unity could seem naive or even foolish. But what made this speech so powerful is that it didn't offer a sugar-coated version of unity. It wasn't about pretending everything was fine. It was about building a deeper, stronger foundation, one that could hold our differences without collapsing under them. The speaker didn't deny the fractures. He acknowledged them openly. He spoke honestly about the pain people carried, the histories that divided them, the injustices that continue to live in plain sight. But instead of using those realities to deepen the divide, he used them to issue a challenge. Can we look at our shared pain and still choose each other? Can we disagree without destroying one another? Can we fight for justice without losing our humanity in the process? Unity, he argued, isn't about everyone thinking the same way. It's about everyone being committed to the same principles: dignity, equality, opportunity, freedom. Principles that should transcend party, background, or ideology. And he urged the nation to remember that these values have never belonged to one side. They are the inheritance of anyone who calls this country home. Throughout the speech, he wove stories of people coming together even when it was hard. Civil rights activists who stood arm in arm despite threats. Veterans and immigrants who fought side by side for a flag they both believed in. Parents working multiple jobs to give their children a better life no matter their color, language, or last name. These weren't just examples. They were reminders that unity has always been possible and that we are better when we remember each other's humanity. But unity doesn't mean silence. It doesn't mean ignoring injustice, and this speech made that clear. The speaker rejected the idea that peace requires people to swallow their pain. Real unity, he said, starts with truth, with reckoning with the hard conversations that so many avoid, because if we don't face what divides us, we can never fully stand together. Still, he made it known, unity is a choice, a moral one, a strategic one, a necessary one, and it starts in the small places in our neighborhoods, our workplaces, our schools, our conversations. It starts when we decide to listen instead of accuse, to learn instead of dismiss, to build instead of break. That's the kind of unity he was calling for, not a shallow agreement, but a deep commitment, a willingness to see beyond the headlines, beyond the talking points, beyond the labels we place on one another. A unity that holds space for anger, but refuses to be driven by hate. A unity that understands our destinies are tied together whether we like it or not. He made it clear, if we let division win, the consequences won't just be political. They'll be personal. Our communities will fracture. Our children will inherit deeper wounds. Our progress will slow. But if we choose unity not just once, but repeatedly, we can create a future where difference is strength, not weakness. And that choice isn't up to one leader. It's up to each of us. Every time we walk into a room, vote in an election, speak out online, or respond to someone who thinks differently, we are making that choice. And this speech reminds us, unity doesn't come from waiting, it comes from doing. That is why these words still matter. Because in a world where division is profitable and anger is contagious, choosing unity is nothing short of revolutionary. It takes courage, it takes discipline, and it takes faith not just in institutions, but in people, in the belief that even now, we can still choose to build something together. This speech isn't just about what's wrong. It's about what's possible, and unity real, durable, Durned unity is still within reach, but only if we reach for it. Every generation is handed a version of a promise. Not a guarantee, not a gift, but a promise that if you work hard, play by the rules, and contribute your part, you have a fair shot. A shot at building a life of meaning, of stability, of dignity. A shot at justice, opportunity, and freedom. This idea, the American promise, is not fixed in stone or locked in the past. It's living. It must be re-earned and redefined by each generation that inherits it. This speech brings that truth to the forefront. It reminds us that the country we live in today didn't simply happen. It was built slowly, painfully, and imperfectly by generations who dared to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. It was carried forward not just by presidents or lawmakers, but by citizens, workers, dreamers, teachers, soldiers, parents, people who were willing to put their shoulder to the wheel of progress even when the odds were against them. But a promise is only as strong as the people who uphold it. That's what this message warns us. The American promise isn't automatic. It can fade, it can break. It can be weakened by injustice, inequality, apathy, and fear. And the moment we begin to treat it like something that's owed to us rather than something we are stewards of, we risk losing what makes it powerful. This speech calls on all of us to remember that we are not just beneficiaries of a system. We are its caretakers, that every right we enjoy to vote, to speak freely, to worship, to learn, to grow exists because someone before us fought to secure it. And just as others sacrificed to hand us this version of the promise, we are now responsible for what we hand to those who come next. It's easy to think of democracy as a backdrop, a set of systems and traditions that run on their own. But the speech disrupts that idea. It says democracy isn't a machine, it's a relationship, a contract. And like any relationship, it requires attention, honesty, effort, and trust. It requires us not only to expect things from our country, but to give things to it, especially our time, our conscience, and our voice. The speaker speaks directly to those who feel left out of the promise, those who have worked hard and still been pushed aside, those who have followed the rules and still been treated unfairly. He doesn't deny that reality, he confronts it. But he also refuses to let it become the end of the story, because the American promise, at its best, is not a lie we tell ourselves. It's a goal we chase, one that becomes more real every time someone stands up and says, "I deserve to be included too." And so the speech shifts the frame. Instead of asking what the country has done for us lately, it asks a harder question. What have we done to preserve the promise for each other? Have we made it easier or harder for the next person to succeed? Have we told the truth even when it hurt? Have we stood up for fairness even when it didn't serve us directly? Have we treated our citizenship as a privilege or a chore? These aren't easy questions. But they are necessary because a nation is only as strong as its commitment to its own ideals. If we don't fight for justice, it won't grow. If we don't protect opportunity, it won't last. If we don't believe in freedom not just for ourselves, but for everyone, it becomes hollow. The most striking thing about this speech is that it doesn't center around despair. It acknowledges the weight of responsibility, but it does so with a sense of purpose. It speaks to young people, new Americans, workers, students, and says clearly, "You are the future authors of this promise. You will shape whether it becomes more inclusive or more exclusive. You will decide if it grows stronger or fades into memory, and in those words is a kind of hope, not soft, not sentimental, but powerful. Because it places faith in the people, not just in leaders or systems, but in the everyday individual who decides to care. It says, you don't need to be perfect to make a difference, you just need to show up. To speak, to vote, to build, to believe, to carry forward what others handed to you and make it stronger for someone else. That is the heart of the American promise, not that it has been perfectly fulfilled, but that it is still worth fighting for, still worth working toward, still worth believing in. So if you're listening to this message wondering what your role is, wondering if it's too late or too far gone, the answer is simple. The promise is yours now. And what you do with it will shape the country your children and grandchildren inherit. It's not just history, it's your turn. Citizenship isn't just a label printed on a passport or an ID card. It isn't just a legal designation you inherit by birth or acquire through paperwork. Real citizenship, the kind this speech speaks of, is something much deeper, much more active. It's not a status, it's a responsibility, a practice, a choice you make every single day. That's what makes this part of the speech so profound. It redefines what it means to belong. It challenges the idea that just living in a country makes you a full participant in it. Instead, it presents a more demanding, more meaningful vision that to be a citizen is to be engaged not just in moments of crisis or celebration, but consistently. It is to pay attention, to care, to show up, In this speech, the speaker offers a vision of citizenship that isn't transactional, it's transformational. He doesn't tell people to simply expect things from their country. He invites them to invest in it, to see themselves not as customers of democracy, but as co-owners of it, to understand that every right they enjoy was earned, and every freedom they hold can only endure if they protect it. This message hits hard because it pushes against the culture of convenience that often surrounds modern life. It's easy to scroll past the news, to skip the vote, to assume that someone else, someone richer, louder, more powerful, will take care of the big issues. But the speech reminds us that if everyone does that, the foundation cracks, the silence grows, and suddenly the decisions that shape our lives are being made without us. So instead, it issues a call: be involved. Be awake, be accountable. It doesn't demand perfection. It doesn't expect everyone to be political experts or full-time activists, but it does insist that citizenship means paying attention, that you don't get to opt out of the work of democracy just because it's messy or slow or frustrating. That democracy is a living thing, and like any living thing, it needs to be fed, defended, and renewed. And what's beautiful about this idea is how inclusive it is. You don't have to be wealthy or powerful to be a citizen in this way. You don't need a fancy title or a microphone. The speech makes clear that real citizenship happens in ordinary places: at the school board meeting, at the food drive, in the neighborhood cleanup, at the voting booth. It happens when you talk to your kids about justice, when you listen before you argue, when you stand up for someone who's been silenced. The speaker gives weight to all of these small, quiet acts, not because they're dramatic, but because they add up. They form the culture of a nation. They shape how we treat one another. They teach the next generation what it means to participate, not just spectate. And this kind of participation isn't always glamorous. Sometimes it's boring. Sometimes it feels like it doesn't matter. But this speech tells us that's when it matters most. Because democracy doesn't die with one blow, it erodes slowly. When people start thinking their voice doesn't count. When cynicism replaces commitment. When we forget that freedom is fragile. That's why the speaker brings it back to us, to individuals. He reminds us that each person has a sphere of influence. You may not be able to fix the whole world, but you can shape the world around you. And if everyone takes that seriously, the collective impact is enormous. He also speaks to young people, in particular, those still learning what it means to belong. He tells them, this country needs your energy, your vision, your courage. And not someday now, not after you graduate or get a job or have it all figured out. Your voice matters today, because citizenship isn't something you grow into. It's something you practice as you grow. What makes this section of the speech resonate so deeply is its honesty. It doesn't pretend that engagement is easy. It doesn't deny the frustration of feeling unheard or the exhaustion of trying to fix a broken system. But it says clearly, giving up is not an option. Looking away is not an answer. If you care about this country, you have to participate in it even when it's hard. And in that truth is a kind of empowerment. Because it means you don't have to wait for permission. You don't have to wait for a perfect moment. You don't even have to wait for hope to come back. You can act now, right where you are. You can claim your role as a citizen not with words, but with action. That's the heartbeat of the speech. Citizenship as a daily act. Something lived, not claimed. Something proven, not presumed. Something done together, not alone. Because in the end, the future doesn't belong to the loudest voices or the angriest crowds. It belongs to those who show up over and over with their sleeves rolled up, their minds open, and their hearts steady. Leadership is often misunderstood. Too many believe it's about reaching the top, being in control, getting the credit, or standing in the spotlight. But this speech turns that definition on its head. It presents a higher, deeper idea of what leadership really means, not just rising for your own sake, but lifting others as you climb, not standing above people, but standing with them. Leadership in its truest form is service. This message isn't about position, it's about purpose. You don't need to hold a title to be a leader. You don't need to run for office or sit at a boardroom table. Leadership, as defined in this speech, is about using your influence, your time, and your energy to make things better for others, especially those who are struggling, ignored, or unheard. What makes this idea powerful is that it calls on everyone, not just the elite or the powerful. It says leadership starts the moment you take responsibility for something bigger than yourself. It might begin in a classroom, in a community center, in a conversation. It might mean being the one who listens when no one else will, or being the person who asks the hard question when everyone else stays silent, or choosing to act not because it's easy or popular, but because it's right. The speech acknowledges the pressure many feel to chase success for its own sake, to build resumes, collect accolades, and focus on individual gain. But it gently reminds us that the most respected, lasting form of leadership doesn't come from how high you rise. It comes from what you do when you get there. Do you hold the door open behind you? Do you share what you've learned? Do you make space for others to rise too? It's easy to forget this in a world that glorifies self-promotion. A world where being seen can feel more important than making a difference. But the speech challenges that mindset. It urges us to ask, what kind of legacy do we want to leave? One of individual triumph, or one of collective progress? Because true leaders don't just climb ladders, they build bridges. They don't hoard opportunity, they multiply it. There's also a deep moral call here. The speech says leadership requires empathy, the ability to understand someone else's pain and carry a piece of it with you, to listen before judging, to care before criticizing, and it's not a soft, sentimental kind of empathy. It's active, it asks something of you. It tells you that your job as a leader is not to rule over people, but to walk alongside them, especially when they're facing hardship. This message connects especially well in times of division and uncertainty. When people are afraid, angry, or feeling invisible, leadership that centers itself only deepens the wound. But leadership that sees the overlooked, that names injustice, that fights for fairness, that reminds people they are not alone, becomes a healing force. The speech draws on history to prove this. It references the leaders who made the biggest differences, not by towering over others, but by empowering them. Teachers who stayed late to help a struggling student. Organizers who knocked on every door in their neighborhood. Workers who stood up not just for their own rights, but for their colleagues. These aren't dramatic acts, they're consistent ones. And that's what real leadership looks like. It also calls out the courage it takes to lead this way, because lifting others isn't always rewarded. It doesn't always lead to fame or fortune. Sometimes it means being misunderstood, underestimated, or even criticized. But this speech insists that leadership is not about reward, it's about responsibility. When you've been given opportunity, you have an obligation to make sure others get a fair shot too. The most inspiring part of this message is its optimism. It believes that leadership is not a scarce resource reserved for a select few. It's something that lives in all of us, waiting to be awakened. Whether you're a student, a parent, a worker, or a citizen, you have the power to lead. You have the power to make someone's life better. And that, the speaker says, is the highest use of any position of influence. Because in the end, the question isn't how far you go. It's how many people you bring with you. It's not about how loudly your name is remembered, but how deeply your efforts are felt. True leadership isn't about